disabled people are viewed as de facto vulnerable and in need of help. And like, if I come up to a woman, let's say, and I say like, excuse me, like, I know that women are vulnerable, so I'm just going to grab you by the elbow and walk with you. And then the woman says like, no, I'm okay. I say, no, please. I know lots of women and I understand the vulnerability of women. I'm going to walk with you for this block. Like, I'm going to go to jail, right? And yet this is an experience that I promise you every day in every city in America, a blind person has.
Welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're going on an unusual trip. We'll be temporarily accompanying two men, Mark Erelli and Andrew Leland, on their separate journeys to the same destination. Both are moving gradually from the world of sight to one of blindness. Musician and songwriter Mark Erelli was performing in 2020 when he looked down at his guitar and couldn't see his fingers on the frets. A subsequent diagnosis of RP, retinitis pigmentosa, terrified him. He learned he had a degenerative condition with an uncertain timeline, but one which would eventually lead to blindness. Understandably, he was filled with lots of questions. Would his diminished eyesight decrease his creative insight? How was he supposed to write and sing his truth if he could no longer observe the world around him? These questions, along with his drive to regain his creative agencies, formed the basis for his album, Lay Your Darkness Down. We'll actually hear Mark perform a couple of tracks for us later in the program. Andrew Leland is a writer and audio producer who recently published The Country of the Blind, a memoir at the end of sight, which describes his position, now suspended in the liminal state of the soon-to-be blind. Midway through his life with RP, Andrew now sees the world as if through a narrow tube. Soon, but he doesn't know when, he will lose his sight. So, gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Great to be here.
So, Andrew, let's start with you. Your book takes us on an expansive exploration of the state of blindness, including your own changing attitude towards it and how it's affecting your livelihood and your relationships. Maybe we should start first with the terminology. The historical use of the word blind, vision, insight have got all sorts of implications. Many of them are negative. So perhaps you could talk just a little bit about that, including the title of the book, which I think you borrowed from an H.G. Wells short story with a very different plot.
Thanks for having me. The language question, a lot of times when people see my cane or, know that I have a visual impairment or that I'm blind, or whichever, phrase you want to use, they'll say, an innocuous phrase like, oh, do you see what I mean? Or I'll see you later, and then catch themselves and be very apologetic and be like, I mean, I will be in a physical room setting with you at a future, and they're just, they get all caught up on it. And Helen Keller actually has a really wonderful passage about this in one of her books, and basically her point I think still stands, which she being like a scholar of she studied Latin, and I think she points to the word visit, which the Latin root visitare I think has visual implications, but the point is that like if you tried to speak at all, even setting aside obviously visual words like speculation or enlightenment or envision or and so on, you're just not going to be able to communicate. And I've hung out with a lot of blind people, through the course of writing this book, and they'll say things like, oh, let me see that. And then, you'll hand it to them and they'll check it out and they've seen it, and so I think in a way, like there's a good intention of wanting to be sensitive, right? And say, I won't see you later, or you'll see, but I think the reality is that the generous move actually is to just include blind people in visual language. And The damaging relationship to language comes when you use blindness as a synonym for ignorance, and that is the actual that's the toxic ingredient there. It's when you say, you'd have to be blind not to see that Mitt Romney, blah blah blah, whatever. Because then you're really taking a literal condition, blindness, and equating it with ignorance, and that wouldn't be a problem if there weren't such a profound stigma and a really durable and omnipresent present day attitude towards blindness and blind people as deficient and as lesser than, and as intellectually diminished, and sort of incapable in a whole host of ways. And so that's my sort of gloss on the language question. As far as the H.G. Wells title that I borrowed, The Country of the Blind, I mean, you say it's a very different example, and it is. H.G. Wells, was an early sci-fi writer. That story is about an explorer in the Andes who gets separated from his group in a landslide, and then finds himself in this sorry, I may have a visitor. He finds himself in a lost valley, which is the sort of proverbial country of the blind, where this village has been living for generations without vision. And hello, my son is here, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone, welcome to the stage, Oscar Leland. I don't know why he's here. I wrote him a note. Maybe he missed the note. But so it goes. I'm doing a live event in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so I can't talk to you right now. You're locked out of the house. The back door is unlocked. Okay, love you. Ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm round of applause for Oscar Leland, who is now gone for the remainder, I promise, of tonight's proceedings. In conclusion,
Saturday Night Live might want to use it,
I mean, I think they're going to want Oscar. You guys missed the real. He didn't know the back door was unlocked. What are you going to do? He just came home from school. Go, take it away, Mary. You want me to finish talking about H.G. Wells, or are we?
Well, it's just that it's interesting because in some ways it reflects to me again what you're saying on a larger scale, which is blindness. Often in the Bible or in ancient times was to inflict blindness on someone was this big deal, morally, metaphysically, and I just wondered. It's rarely you're suddenly giving someone the gift of being blind. I don't think I ever remember seeing that. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I write a little bit about this. One of the few positive instances that you might point to would be like in law, right? Like blind justice. But even that is problematic. And I have a chapter in the book called Lady Justice, who is the classical figure of the woman wearing the blindfold and holding the scales. But it's true. It is, as with most disabilities, a overwhelmingly stigmatized and negative symbol in culture, which does nothing to erase the reality of the real joy and normalcy that many disabled people live with every day. So just because it is so deep in the language does not justify that presentation.
So you're sort of straddling two worlds right now, both of you, but Andrew, you first, and you talk about this in the book. Initially, you kind of resist the distinctive markers of blindness. Your cane. You've got a very ambivalent relationship with that, and then you change your view towards it. You actually, I'm going to quote now. You say, "I live in a weird, shadowy landscape between blindness and sight, which has forced a reckoning to try and let go of my desperate desire for resolution." I thought that was a huge statement, because the resolution thing is on so many levels, isn't it? So what did you mean by, how do you navigate this in between?
Yeah. I mean, I think I surprised myself by finishing the book and realizing that was in some ways the landing point, which is to say, a lot of the journey of writing the book and of becoming blind and trying to understand it, I thought more had to do with accepting blindness. But in a way, the way that I've begun to accept blindness is actually to accept the ambiguity of not having lost all of my vision. And one of the biggest obstacles to accepting blindness has been my relationship with my remaining sight and Um, you know, we were talking a little bit before we started about, what advice one would give to somebody who's losing their sight. Um, and I have to be conscious of like my relationship with Mark Erelli, who, because like when we met, I feel like there's this like, I see just in the, because I was diagnosed in, when I was 18 years old, more than 20 years ago. And, Mark was just diagnosed a couple of years ago. And so I do feel like there's this interesting, I don't know, just a relationship between our phases along the path, and I'm a cane user. Mark, I think, is not yet a cane user, or, anyway. So that's all to say that, like, just to be conscious of the sort of interesting dyad that we make here. But one of the hardest things about RP and beginning on the journey is like, you need to learn how to use these tools before you really need them, and then it sneaks up on you, and then you need them. And so the idea of like using a cane when you can still see that the light has changed feels paradoxical, and I'm just filled with this imposter syndrome. But actually, it's crucial to your survival, I think, to sort of get a head start on that stuff. And it really forces one to say, you know what, yeah, I can still see when the light changes, but also this cane is a crucial tool for me, despite the fact that people on the street are looking at you like you're a fraud. And so that's the beginning of an answer to that question.
So that's a very good point to jump over to Mark, because just where you are now, I imagine there are some changes that have already occurred, because you have to travel as a musician, you have to get yourself in and out of ill-lit locations to sing, and then you do a rehearsal and the light is one way, and then you start performing and the house lights go down and it's another way. So how has that been?
Well, I mean, I'm just loving hearing Andrew talk about all this stuff, because I'm such a huge fan, and I am a little bit earlier in my journey with this, but reading his book has been so helpful in terms of framing it, framing blindness as identifying the agency you have as you go blind, right? Like, it's not just even just the word, like going blind. Like, in his book, he has this great part about someone saying that they talk about becoming blind. It's this thing that you become rather than this place that you go that you can't return from. And that's all just been so helpful for me. Initially, it was very disorienting, because I would say that at least when I was diagnosed, my daytime vision with my glasses on was pretty good. The problem for me is that the situations or the context in which I am kind of functionally blind, those are like 80% of my working conditions, right? Dark backstages, dark rooms with bright lights in your face, high contrast between the darkness of the audience and the brightness of the stage lights, coming out of the venue at midnight when it's dark. It's so much of my work has to happen in this context where it's really hard and becoming harder. And so I've just had to really focus on trying to give myself a little grace and a little forgiveness, and also just stay laser focused on solutions and little problem solving techniques that I can adopt. Anything that helps even a little bit. If I can see 5% better by doing X, then I do that every time, And I just want to stay. I know my vision is going to change, but I just want to stay a vital working musician. So anything that I can do to kind of make that, that transition work, I'm going to do it.
So both of you are still extremely involved in the line of work that you are going to stay in. So we were just talking before about this. I think it's very interesting how different, just in the short time that Andrew's been dealing with this, how the technology has assisted the things, the tasks, the problem solving, the getting things done so much easier than, well, I'll let you say what you think, Andrew.
Just the change in technology and its impact on blind people. is your question. Yeah. I think, you know, my perspective is different than obviously somebody who grew up blind, because, you know, not only am I still in the realm of low vision, but, you know, I've started to learn all this stuff in the era of omnipresent screen readers and access technology being head and shoulders above what it was. I interviewed a woman, a blind writer named Deborah Kent Stein, who lives in Chicago, and she talked about how she would, in order to read as a little girl, she would have to send away to the Library of Congress's Braille library, and Braille is a much bigger format than print. So like, the classic example is like Harry Potter. Obviously Harry Potter hadn't been written in her time, but like, you can buy a paperback of Harry Potter that's what, like three or 400 pages, but the same book in Braille would be in like 4 or 5 volumes. It's like 6 phone books stacked on your desk. So they would only send 1 volume at a time, and then she would send them back, and it would like waiting for this this event when the mail would come so she could get her next volume. And her mother developed polyps on her throat from reading aloud to her and her brother, who was also blind. And then when she finally got access to Bookshare, which is this it's sort of, you can think of it as like the original. Before Spotify, there was this thing called Napster, which Mark Erelli might hate, or maybe love. I don't know your politics of music sharing, but basically it was like a file sharing service for blind bookworms. So blind people would scan books, and then this was the beginning of OCR, right, where you would, the invention of the flatbed scanner, and then the Google Books. If you think of it like, you scan a book of page of print, but then the computer can recognize the print and then turn it into digital text. This was transformative for blind people. And so then Bookshare, you suddenly had eventually millions of titles, including brand new scholarly books. And this writer, Deborah, told me that once she got access to that, she would download dozens and dozens of titles at a time, just in case, like just for later. And the way she talked about it, it was like somebody who grew up in the Depression, like hoarding cans of beans, even though like they could have enough money to just go to the supermarket whenever they want. But like, when I said that to her, she was like, absolutely. Like, I grew up in the book famine. So, stories like that really do make me appreciate my, and honestly, I couldn't have written this book without Bookshare, that service, because I sold the book in 2019, and that was right around the time when, even to this day, like there was a book I was interested in, that a print book that I saw in my house today, and I spent a little time like straining to look at it, but it's just not worth it. Like if I actually want to read that book, I'm going to download it from Bookshare, so I can still see print. But it's like I compare it sometimes, not that I've had this experience, but like, there are plenty of wheelchair users who can take steps if they can walk if they have to, but it's like the wheelchair is just infinitely better option for so many situations, and that it's like that for me in print. So I don't know how I would have written my book without being able to just download dozens and dozens of books and listen to them, and or blow the text up gigantic and invert the colors and do all the incredible maneuvers. And there is a whole world that, Mark, I don't know if you've dipped your toes into yet, but I know lots of blind sound engineers and sound mixers and audio editors, and a lot of that sound editing technology is also is pretty accessible but I also have to throw an asterisk on here, because I think people ask that question, and I say this and it sounds like this utopia, but it's actually a huge problem of digital accessibility, because so much of the world has become digital. That's opened up these new pastures for blind people, but also it creates tremendous barriers. One quick example is software is constantly being updated. So I saw today somebody say like, hey, is anybody else having this problem? Like the Amazon app used to work perfectly with me and my screen reader. I could swipe around and hear everything, but I think they didn't update and now it doesn't work. And that's just a constant experience of the blind person. Is like, you get some configuration of software, it works, and then an update happens. And this is true of any technology user, but when you're an edge case, when you're this sort of minority among users, it's hugely exaggerated. So you might apply for a job, and what do you know, like the software that company uses isn't accessible. So what are you going to do? Are you going to sue them, or are they just not going to give you a job? And so it's far from a utopia.
Mark, you said, quote, certain insights are only available because of the slow, gradual loss of vision. Can you explain a little bit about what you meant by that? Recalibrating your internal compass, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest insight that I've gained thus far comes from the fact that where I am with RP right now, it's mainly an invisible disability. So I'm not using a cane yet. I'm cane curious, I would say, right now, and getting more curious by the day. But I don't, I don't quote unquote look blind to the average person, and so um, a lot of times people assume things that maybe I might have a problem with. I also realize that I'm carrying this thing that they can't see, and there's got to be millions of other people, basically everybody, carrying things that I can't see. They're, not just vision stuff, but their own things. And so, as an artist and as a songwriter, compassion and empathy is actually one of the biggest tools and one of the most effective tools in my toolkit. Not just visual observation, but compassion and empathy are as big, if not bigger. And so having this invisible disability kind of has led me to just be way more cognizant of the fact that though someone might quote unquote look normal, they're likely carrying something or struggling to carry something, and that might be the reason that they're acting a certain way that seems a little bit strange or vexing or frustrating. So for me, that's been one of the biggest insights, that I just have to be a little gentler with myself, and if I'm going to extend that kind of mindset to myself, I should probably, there's nothing to lose from extending it to other people, and there's a lot to gain.
So this is a bit of a wide curve question here. Affects both of you. I was just thinking about, one would have thought, naively perhaps, that if you are losing one sense, that some of your other senses might be more heightened. I was just thinking, if you're about to eat something, there's this visual thing, and I imagine this is for other areas of pleasure in your life, but there's a visual thing, and then you salivate, and the smell, and there's this whole sort of encroachment on all the senses, or union of the senses. So if you don't have that, do those become heightened?
I'm not sure. Maybe maybe if you've been blind since birth, it's different, but they certainly haven't become heightened in the last few years for me. I think that's a bit of a misconception, though I can't speak for certain on that. Andrew's done a lot more research, I think.
My sense is that I agree. I think it's a misconception. I think, certainly like if you and I took a hearing test, Mary, I don't think you're going to perform. I don't think I'm going to perform better on the hearing test by virtue of my visual impairment. Your ear functioning does not increase. I think what does increase is your relationship with the sensors. It's not even that it increases, but it changes. And I love this passage in a book written by a blind academic where he talks about waiting for a cab on the corner with a bunch of his friends who are sighted, and he hears the cab first. It's not because his hearing is better, it's because like they're all staring at their phones and not paying attention, and he's listening more. So I think that
Paying
dynamic.
attention to something.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I mean, I get this all the time in music, like, oh, doesn't vinyl sound nice and warm, and or don't CDs sound really, crisp and high fidelity? And it's like, it all sounds great, and the best music is the music you're really listening to.
Mm-hmm.
If you just got stuff on in the background, it doesn't sound great. It doesn't sound as good as if you're focused and really savoring it. And it's the same with food. If you're just eating to not be hungry anymore, it doesn't taste as good, no matter what it is, even if it's like a Twinkie. If you're savoring that Twinkie, it's gonna be a whole different experience sensually than just wolfing it down.
On the food thing, there's a book called Touching the Rock by a Australian theologian, John Hull, who went blind in middle age and recorded a series of audio cassette diaries in the 80s, and then he transcribed them and turned them into this book. And it's a classic in the sort of canon of blind memoirs. but it's also like a book that I would never recommend somebody who's going blind read, because being what it is, which is this audio diary right in the like immediate aftermath of his vision loss, right, right in the middle of his life, it's full of this grief that, say what you want about the, uh uh positive aspects of disability that are inarguable and that do exist. There's always going to be a grief if you lose something after having had it and relying on it. And he has this passage where he talks about sex and food in a kind of connected way, where he says, I'm sitting at dinner, and this is after he's gone blind, and somebody says, like, the waiter's going around with the potatoes, and he's like, what does that even mean to me? Like, potatoes, like, I don't have that, like, just as you described it, Mary, this sort of like, inspiring desire of the visual impact of the, and it's the same thing with sex, he writes, like, he feels this sort of pang the same way one would with hunger, but like absent that like, I think the phrase he uses, like the full-bodied impact, of the sight of a woman. um and I quoted that very kind of dutifully in an early draft of my book, talking about like, okay, so this is something that I have to look forward to, right? Like, I'm not going to enjoy food or sex anymore because I won't have that. And a couple of blind friends read the draft, and they were like, I don't know if, what our cussing policy is on Cambridge Forum, but in effect they said poppycock, bosh. um like, I enjoy food and sex, and like, and to their point, they were like, that is a memoir of his grief, and like, yeah, like, you're gonna feel that way in the throes of the grief, but you get over the grief and you learn to adapt, and part of that adaptation is a kind of restructuring of your modalities, right? Which is to say, like, you can access pleasure through different modalities, and so that's a long-term process, but it is a process that is real and can happen.
Yeah. That whole concept of grief and how it relates to where you are on your journey with a particular disability, it has been something that I've been really thinking a lot, because uh, I that was the dominant emotion when I first in the wake of my diagnosis. I was diagnosed during the pandemic. I had to go into the hospital alone. It's like 7 hours of testing, a lot of which is in like a darkened room and where you're just alone. And then I had to be told alone with just my doctor. And then we called my wife, who wasn't in the same room. Uh, it was a lot, and the grief was immediate and overwhelming. And I think the dominant reaction was grieving this life that we thought we were going to live, my wife and I. And as Andrew said, you get over that, or you don't get over it, you get through it, you learn how to carry it. It becomes just part of who you are in a way. But another thing that I've learned through, starting to become blind, is I didn't know the life that I was going to live. I'm grieving this thing that I couldn't have even known. And not only can I have not known it, nobody knows what's going to happen the rest of today or tomorrow or, 5-10 years out. We don't know. We plan, we have hopes and dreams and stuff, but nobody knows. And so here I was grieving this thing it was kind of like false hope, I think, that I was clinging to, and it's hard when you realize that, but it had this kind of beneficial effect of just really making me think about the present and trying to be a little bit more mindful. I don't always succeed. In fact, I rarely succeed. I'm always trying, and I rarely succeed. But that grief of the life that I thought I was going to live, I do feel like I have learned how to carry that as just part of who I am. But really, none of us know that. And
you raise a very interesting point, which is that, well, when we all, for example, into a marriage, we're taking this contract on really not knowing what the future holds. And in both your cases, it was quite different, because this happened to you quite unexpectedly, and then you had to adapt to that and share the knowledge with your wife in the future. Andrew references it several times during the book because he actually had this much, much earlier, and then he finally got it diagnosed. Were you in college or?
Yeah, yeah.
And then, of course, you fell in love. And so when you actually told your wife, she was completely on board mentally in some theoretical way with what she was taking on. And I just wondered, well, I'll let you tell the story about appraising that and reappraising that.
Yeah. You know, you're right that our situations are quite different, although I don't know how much I gained from having had the diagnosis already, because I think the misconceptions were so I'll put it this way. We both knew so little about blindness and so little about, we had imagined so little about it. And it was so distant. Like I was still driving. I think I had stopped driving at night when we met. So, but I still drove during the day, didn't own a cane. And it was just sort of like this abstraction. And so like she knew, yeah, like I've got this degenerative retinal disease, and she's, extremely intelligent, and I think probably like could see through to the end of that, in some logical way. But I think that neither of us had any real, especially where we are now, like no concrete or practical or emotional, like practical in the emotional sense of like what that actually meant. And so I really think, and I don't think you can, I don't think like
Yeah,
you can
I don't think so
read John
either.
Hull or my book or anything, listen to your records, like you have to live it to understand it, which
No,
I think is probably true of
I
marriage at
agree,
large, right?
you
Like
know, but
yeah,
you,
yeah,
she was like taking this, even if it was something that you had no concept of what you were signing up for. She, in theory, said, "I know you've got this condition, you're going to go blind, and I
yeah.
love you anyway." And you said the same, and you actually said, "Are you sure?" kind or something on those lines.
Yeah.
But Mark had suddenly, it's like somebody changed the direction of the ship,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe it's the ship his wife didn't think she was getting on, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
And your
you'd have
kid.
to
I
ask
mean,
her.
yeah, no. So I'm just saying, Andrew speaks regularly. They have these. He's very honest in the book, right, about having run-ins or misunderstandings. Should we label things? Should we not label things? I mean, it's like an ongoing thing. It probably makes you more proactive than the regular couples.
Well, it's all about communication, right? I mean, there's a part in Andrew's book where I think you take out the cane for the first time in front of your wife at in a restaurant, out to dinner with friends, and there's this understandable surprise, and hearing stories like that, it's already made me more proactive, more proactively communicative with my wife, saying like, I just went to New York City and was walking around at night one night, trying to find my way from one place to another in an unfamiliar place. And I called my wife the next day and I said, I think I need to start looking at canes, and I just wanted to let you know so that we can start getting used to this, And it was basically inspired entirely by that story in Andrew's book, going like, oh, I don't want to have that experience, if I don't want to put her through that surprise, and shock. So you kind of learn from each other, in a way.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. Well, there's two things there, or maybe more, but the learning from each other thing is huge. I think, in some ways, like writing the book was just like a giant excuse for me to build this really robust network of blind experts that now I can like text every day, which I do, and I'm constantly getting advice about everything from like tech to the more kind of emotionally salient things, and I just feel like it's like a snowball effect. Like now you're in there in the network, Mark, and like I love meeting people who are going through something similar. It's not just RP either, but just like and it even extends beyond blindness to disability. So I think that's a really important part of what you said. But then the other part for me, and like the story about Lily in the restaurant, is I think maybe there's something to what you say, Mary, that like if you're in a relationship with somebody with a disability, you have to, how did you put it? You have to be more
tuned in or proactive.
Proactive, yeah, maybe. But I also, when I look at other friends and other marriages that I know, like it's the same dynamic. And the dynamic, like with me and Lily and the cane, was I wasn't being honest with myself about the cane. Like I was being awkward. I was having all of these ugly feelings around it, and I wasn't really like clear with myself about them. And so then I just sort of like awkwardly like busted it out for myself, which works if you're like alone or in a vacuum or not in a relationship. But because I hadn't really talked about them or thought about them fully with myself, and I certainly hadn't talked about them with her, it just became this like intrusion into both of our lives, as opposed to doing what Mark is doing very, what much more, I think, thoughtfully, having reflected on it, it smooths the path for that. And so I think that dynamic can happen with anyone where there's something going on with you and you're not going to be able to communicate with your partner, with the people in your life, until you sort of interrogate it for yourself first.
Mark, I see you're sitting with your guitar. It might be a good time to have a song from you. You were going to play, I think, By Degrees, which when the first time I heard it on the radio was struck by it, because I thought it was talking about Trump's ever worsening behavior becoming the new normal, and that you could learn to live with anything if it happened by degrees. But of course, you didn't have that in mind. So maybe you want to tell us, and you wrote it before you had your diagnosis in 2018, right?
Yeah. I mean, I wrote this song in response to just the intense sorrow from the epidemic of gun violence in the United States, and how numb I was starting to feel to it, and how I didn't want to feel that way, and how did it get this way? And so, I start the song with this wish of kind of not having to view all this pain and hatred and sorrow in the world. And at the time, the best thing that I could come up with was, when I take a look around me, sometimes I wish I was blind. And, now I have to sing this song every night. And I do not wish that I was blind at all. But, the notion of resisting getting used to things that kind of degrade in small increments, when it comes to gun violence or American democracy or what have you, I do think that there is real value in pushing back. And yet, ironically now, I found myself having to face this, loss, this degradation that happens in small increments by degrees every day with my vision. And I'm actually trying to, like Andrew said before, accept that and be at peace with that kind of slow motion volatility. And so, this song really has changed or taken on added layers of meaning for me. So I'll play it for you now. This is called By Degrees. When I take a look around me, sometimes I wish I was blind. Feels like something sacred's dying, one headline at a time, and I can't tear myself away. No, I just stare in disbelief. You can learn to live with anything when it happens by degrees. And I've seen every head bowed down as if lost in private prayer. I've seen the phones in every hand, seen the long and vacant stares of souls gone numb, thumbing through each ceaseless change in feed. You can learn to live with anything when it happens by degrees. I've seen pundits shouting back and forth across some great divide against a map of red and blue, points of view so cut and dried. But when you look into the mirror, What color country do you see where you can learn to live with anything when it happens by degrees? And I've seen the flags at half-staff as a nation mourned and moaned. I've seen the stars and bars of flying proud above the State House dome. For the Charleston 9 we sing, I once was blind, but now I see. We can learn to live with anything when it happens by degrees. And I've seen little hands on little shoulders, children in a line. I've seen them led away from school as the shots rang out inside. And I thought something has to change, but somehow it's become routine. We can learn to live with anything when it happens by degrees. I've seen sadness seep into my heart, each day just a little more. This darkness growing so familiar, I can't recall what came before. My children's faces filled with questions, looking up expectantly, and I don't know what to tell them. No, I can't bring myself to tell them that you can learn to live with anything when it happens by degrees.
Well, I'm clapping for everybody. That was wonderful, Mark.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm just glad I didn't cough in the middle of it. I'm getting over a cold. So
That's wonderful. It was interesting because you had said, I'm going to quote, this is quite a long quote, but it's amazing. I record at home using a slower, more deliberate approach than in the past. I layer different colors and tones one at a time in a process more akin to oil painting than snapshots, attuned to a much deeper level of musical and technical detail this time around as a way of compensating for the profound loss of control that I felt in the immediate wake of my new disability.
yeah, I wish I'd known that was what I was doing when I started making the new record. At the time, I was just kind of furiously trying to fight back against, this thing that was happening to me. Normally, when I'd make a record, I would get a bunch of friends together and we would go someplace far away from normal life, maybe someplace I'd never been before, to kind of be inspired by a new surrounding. And the studios or the places where people record are also usually very mood lighting, a lot very dark and dim. And I just thought, how am I going to get to these places? How am I going to see in these places? It just felt so impossible in the kind of catastrophic mindset that I found myself in. So I came down here to this. I call it my studio, but it's really like a 12 by 10 room in my basement. And you can't really see it, thankfully, because it's just an absolute disaster. But it's kind of a disaster by design. Everything is basically within arm's reach. There's a bunch of guitars over here. There's a bass behind me. There's an entire drum kit over here. There's keyboards. There's preamps and microphones right here, all within arm's reach. All I have to do is, excuse me, unplug and plug in a few things, and I can go from inspiration to recording that inspiration in a matter of, minutes. And that I found incredibly comforting. And at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that making a record that way, which is kind of like laying one sound down, then laying another sound on top of it, there's no guarantee that it's going to sound like music, like people feeding off of each other creatively in a room, in a space. That photographic kind of snapshot of like documenting a performance that's captured in time. Most of the classic records, a lot of them are made that way, and that's what I love. But since I didn't feel like I could do that, I took on this oil painting approach and got pretty good at it, to the point where once I started listening back, it felt like music as opposed to all the technical things I'd had to overcome to do it. And so now it's just another tool in the toolkit, and I don't feel so stressed out about it. I can go to places and bring a light if I need to so that I can see, or I can record down here, and it's going to be fine.
So maybe you could demonstrate. Wouldn't you mind doing one more song?
Oh, sure.
The new album.
Sure, yeah. This is a song called "Sense of Wonder," and Andrew talks a lot about this in his book. I'll do it with a cough drop. Is the privileged kind of place that sight holds among the senses, right? And that's it's a you don't really notice it until you kind of have less of it, and then it's kind of all you can notice everywhere. And I wanted to write a song about this. Song predates my diagnosis as well, but it really addresses all the other ways that you can kind of sense and appreciate the world, other than just the visual sense. That's in there too, but there's also things like faith and love and these things that you can't really see, but you can still feel. So here we go. This is called "Sense of Wonder." Giant squid and butterflies, creatures big and mighty, low and small. We can only guess how many kinds with which we share this big blue ball. They say that we know less about the bottom of the ocean than we do about the surface of the moon. So if you ever lose your sense of wonder, honey, it'll be too soon. Every day a new frontier, the backyard was a jungle green and wild. But it gets harder to remember what came as second nature to a child. You know the names of all the roads, and the lawn needs to be mowed, and there's work to pay the bills and make the rent. You might wake up one day and never wonder where your sense of wonder went. Mysteries within mysteries, like an endless set of Russian nesting dolls. And if we could ever get there, we'd find a question at the center of it all. Why something instead of nothing? Are we out here on our own, or does someone or something catch us when we fall? Without a sense of wonder, it begins to seem so tragic and so small. But it ain't all unicorns and rainbows. Surely you've suspected this by now. Some days feel like a competition to find the biggest way to let each other down. And I don't blame you if you're worried. Sometimes I'm worried too, and I don't believe it when I say it'll all work out. 'Cause it don't seem to make no sense, and it's no wonder sometimes we all have our doubts. We are made of stardust, electrons dance into a cosmic reel. Light is particle and wave, but even this cannot explain the way it feels. So give all you have to give, 'cause at best it's relative. Love is how we pull each other through. Hold on to your sense of wonder. Keep yours for me and I'll keep mine for you. Never lose your sense of wonder, babe. Keep yours for me and I'll keep mine for you. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
So,
much.
I wanted to bring up something that's a kind of a bit of a tricky topic. Andrew in the book talks about actually going along to the first picnic he was sort of trying out the blind community and feeling really awkward and ill at ease and out of place, really. And I think there's some hesitation amongst sighted people about exactly how to behave towards blind individuals. And I'm going to ask you first, Mark, what is it you want from interactions with people? You want help from them? Do you want them to just pretend that there's no problem?
Well, I think everyone just wants to be treated like a human, you know? And the golden rule, I think, really can go a long way here, you know? Would you like someone to come up from, you know, maybe behind you and grab a part of your body and force you into what they thought you were trying to do and say, I'm helping you? Or would you like someone to say, excuse me, sir or ma'am, do you need any help? I'd be happy to assist. And, you know, I think the latter is what probably a lot of people want. It's not that people don't ever want assistance. I think there's times when, you know, people might want assistance, including me, especially when I'm trying to find like a black cable on the black stage carpet or something, you know. But it just helps. It just helps when people don't assume anything first and just ask, you know, do you need any help? And I'd say, oh no, I got it, I'm good, you know. Or yeah, it would really be helpful. I can't see that freaking cable down there. So I think that's a good rule of thumb.
All right, just quickly, I'm going to ask, and Andrew talks about this in the book, and he gets quite aggravated and says, you know, that our misplaced acts of kindness, which could be our motivation. He said, the more I use my cane to find curbs and doorways, the more patronizing and intrusive and sometimes hostile strangers become. So what is your take the same as Mark's?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think people don't ask. People look at disabled people, blind people, and the assumption is, and Mary, I'm affectionately gonna, quote what you just said. You said pretend like there's not a problem just now, right? What if there isn't a problem? What if there's no pretending needed, right?
Right.
No,
because the assumption is that that a blind person is a problem, right? Like when I go into an airport, I feel like a problem, and I hear disabled people talk in these terms like, like, is it okay that I'm here? Like in a kind of an ironic way, right? Like, yeah, it is okay that I'm here. And that weighs on you over the years, that feeling of being a problem in non-disabled space, in public, it begins to, I think it begins to grate. So that's where you hear the frustration coming from. And there's something really tricky that I'm still working to wrap my head around, which is that idea about good intentions, right? Because I think a lot of people do think like, well, look, like I'm just being a good person, like trying to help. And yet here you are like ornery as hell. Like, what's your problem? I'm just being a good citizen. But I think Mark gets at the problem, which is that, and again, just to kind of echo Mark, like, put yourself in those shoes, right? And I think I don't know if this is a problematic comparison, but I'll just take a crack at making it. Like, I think part of the problem is that disabled people are viewed as de facto vulnerable and in need of help. And like, if I come up to a woman, let's say, and I say like, excuse me, like, I know that women are vulnerable, so I'm just going to grab you by the elbow and walk with you. And then the woman says like, no, I'm okay. I say, no, please. I know lots of women and I understand the vulnerability of women. I'm going to walk with you for this block. Like, I'm going to go to jail, right? And yet this is an experience that I promise you every day in every city in America, a blind person has, that they're standing on a street corner and somebody grabs their elbow and says, here we go, the light screen, I got you. Being a good citizen, their intentions are good, just as my intentions in this hypothetical situation are like, I'm helping this vulnerable woman in a neighborhood. And as Mark suggests, like, maybe in some cases, I don't care if it's a woman or a man, disabled or non-disabled, you are going to need help, right? And you say, thank you so much. Like, I was totally lost and I just sprained my ankle. Like, I need help getting to the bus stop. Yes. But you got to ask, because, and not only do you have to ask, but you have to undo a little bit of that default assumption that the person is a problem, that the person is in need of help. And that, in fact, they may just be a person happily going through their lives without any trouble whatsoever.
I'm going to use another quote quickly, and then we've got to take some questions. There's a lot of very good questions. You said at one point in the book, I tried to understand. I said that you say that you felt that you were becoming a member of a club that you both valued and disdained. You had this ambiguity again. And you said, I tried to understand how blindness was changing my identity as a reader, writer, husband, father, citizen, and otherwise privileged white guy. So I just love the interesting little ending there, because how much different are you fortunate, do you think, to be in America, or is America not doing well in terms of what other countries are doing with this? I mean, you are privileged in the fact that you have, I guess, the money to get an Uber if you need an Uber in some situation. So what did you mean by that? Otherwise privileged white guy.
Yeah, well, I think I had this sense that I was becoming profoundly marginalized as I lost my sight, and that I had this perception, because I began from the sort of mainstream position, mainstream attitude towards disability that I think most people have if you don't grow up with the relationship to disability, which I didn't, which is to see disabled people as like profoundly marginalized. And there's a reason for that, and I think there are huge structural inequalities that affect disabled people. I think an important concept to name is ableism, right? In the same way that there's racism or sexism, there are these sort of systemic prejudices and prejudices against people with disabilities that unnecessarily privilege certain abilities. And so I think I began writing the book and began this journey with this really like kind of curious sense that like, okay, I'm becoming marginalized. And the more reporting I did, the more I realized like, actually, no, like so much of my privilege is remaining perfectly intact, and racial privilege, gender, economic, all those things. And it was really striking to me the way that like what you might call like an intersectional analysis, right? Where there's like all these different intersecting identities kind of brought to bear on what my experience and understanding of blindness was. And just within the world of blindness, there's like the blind 1%, right? Where there's these people with like tens of thousands of dollars of like Braille gizmos, and like Uber elite status, so they get like the extra good Ubers because they know that those drivers are going to be even more likely to like offer them to, take them right exactly where they need to go. And then blind folks who have, the reverse experience. So I think that's what I was getting at with that line.
Okay, we're already at 6, but I'm going to run over a little bit because we've got some good questions. I don't know if you want to answer this, but someone's written when we were talking about senses and enjoying and appreciating the senses. If you could change the loss of vision for the loss of another sense, what would it be and why?
I would get rid of my ability to see the future just because I find it so troubling to know what's going to happen all the time.
Oh, that's interesting. Very cryptic. What about you,
Uh,
Mark?
I don't know. I mean, I'm just grateful that I have my hearing because if I couldn't hear the music that I'm making
Oof,
or that other
yeah.
people are making, I can't really imagine my life, yeah, what that looks like, you know. So for me, that would be even worse than blindness.
Interesting. So I'm going to try and tie things up here before we close. I learned a lot from reading your book about just the whole history of being blind, becoming blind, inventions created by blind people, etc., etc. So I stepped into a world for a little while that I knew little about, and newfound appreciation for the whole thing. Um, and including Samuel Beckett's Endgame, which I detested, but you suddenly had this very insightful comments about the characters there. So, last question, I guess, is are there any new insights that you think are accessible to you both with partial sight? You said, Andrew, the worlds that persist after blindness in the remaining senses, in the imagination, in the depth of feeling that has nothing to do with visuality, far exceed what is lost.
Uh, I stand by those words.
They're
Yeah, I
beautiful.
was sort of, I think in the beginning of that paragraph, paraphrasing James Joyce, who had a lot of vision problems, and was writing a letter to his friend, and he said something like, the visual world is just one of many worlds, and what I'm losing is nothing. There are all these other worlds, and there's such bravado in that statement, but I really do feel that it's true. And I think Mark has touched on that sense, in your preamble, the sense of wonder, and in the song itself, and in your music. I think the great writer Oliver Sacks has a really cool article about, I think it's called what the blind see, or something like that. And then he talks about how we have this sort of popular sense of the senses as being quite siloed, and there's certain affordances that you get visually, certain auditorially and tactilely, but that I think, he argues that if you study how the brain really works and how we experience the senses, that there's a tremendous amount of cross modality, and that and I think cognitive science bears this out. There are studies that show when a blind reader reads Braille or even listens to an audiobook, sometimes there's parts of the visual cortex that light up. And so even like on that really wonky, like cognitive science level, I think it's just an argument for like the brain can remap itself, and the thinking that one does, and the feeling and the sensing and the experiencing of the world that one does, need not be grounded in vision. And like, yes, the wonky academic term for it might be ocular centricism, right? Like this sort of like profound placement of sight at the top of the hierarchy of senses is true of our culture in particular, but many cultures. But it doesn't need to be that way. And one can immerse oneself in the world. And it's been such a privilege to get to know so many blind thinkers, and just blind people who are entirely engaged in the world. It's not exile. It doesn't need to be an exile or a removal from the world. They are immersed, they are active, and that's what I aspire to.
Well, Mark, do you want to add to that?
Man, I mean, I don't know if I could say it any better than that. I think, as an artist, one of the things that I really one of the ways I try and orient myself all the time is kind of active engagement with the world. And observation is one form of active engagement, but it's not the only visual observation is not the only form of active engagement. And I think everything Andrew just said, I don't really know what I could add to that other than it's I don't want to retreat from the world, even the world that I can't see. And I have kids too. They're watching me go through this, and who knows what they have to deal with in their lives someday, some, particular struggle. Hopefully their struggles are their own. But, I want them to know that you have a choice in how you react to things. And I would never have chosen this for myself, if I was given that choice. But now that it's happening, I have a choice in how I react and how I bear it. And again, I'm not perfect. I'm human. I get frustrated and bummed out sometimes. But for the most part, I'm always trying to orient myself towards this kind of hopeful, positive mindset, and and that's just a choice. I just choose to do that, and then tomorrow I'll wake up and I will make the same exact choice to the best of my ability.
Well, thanks so much, Mark Erelli and Andrew Leland, for taking time to take part in this conversation. It's the beginning of a big conversation. Very, very educational, helpful, enjoyable, and wonderful. So two things. These guys, if you go into the box here, the chat box, you can get details about Andrew's book, where you can buy it, and Mark's downloads and CDs. So support these starving artists.
Yeah, my CDs are literally right there. They're right off the frame there.
And also, if you guys would go into the Q&A, there are quite a lot of questions that people might want you to help answer that I can't answer, about organizations and things like that. So I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, Mass Cultural Council, the Cambridge Community Foundation, and you good people. So if you haven't given us anything in a while, now's your chance. So you can go to the website, www.cambridgeforum.org, where you can sign up for a free newsletter. Actually, you don't have to give us anything for that, but that's a secret. We produce weekly NPR broadcasts of this program. A video of today's program will be uploaded to YouTube shortly, thanks to our good partners at GBH Forum Network. Our next forum is Tuesday, November the 28th, Building Bridges to Belonging with Jeffrey Cohen. So sign-up details are already on the website. Thanks for joining us. Enjoyed everything about this program, and I hope to see you all soon.